Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 104. Bucky. There was a part of Bucky that didn't want any part of this. That was not but to find a point on it, utterly terrified of going anywhere near those fuckers anytime in the next couple thousand years. Most of his time in their hands might still be missing from his memory, but he wasn't an idiot. And it wasn't Steve either, always seeing the best in people. He could take a few wild guesses as to the sort of horrors those fuckers had perpetrated on him, just based on what little he knew at this point. And even in the unlikely event of risking being subjected to that again not being a factor, there was still the whole Winter Soldier thing. Bucky didn't exactly trust that to not rear up and bite everyone around him in the butt. And not this soon. Maybe not ever, at least not entirely. Between those two factors, the temptation to sit home or hide in a bunker and wait this out was there. But a far larger part of Bucky would absolutely refuse to let Steve go anywhere, never mind into a fight, where, as sure as the sun rose, the idiot wouldn't watch his six without him dogging Steve's heels. Not to mention the part of him that really wanted to carve those fuckers into bite-sized pieces for what they'd done to him. They wanted to listen to them scream in agony and beg for mercy. So that temptation to stay home never got beyond a background flicker. The array of guns and different kinds and calibers of ammo Stark had stashed in the tower would be worrying if it wasn't also a superhero clubhouse. Bucky could have stayed in the armory petting the guns for days, dithering about which to use because they were all so pretty. Even if it was slightly disconcerting to discover he had an encyclopedic knowledge of almost everything in the room. Apparently, those fuckers had wanted to make sure he knew of and could handle, shoot, and maintain any gun he came across. There were a few exceptions to his knowledge. All Stark Industries stuff. Specifically, 3 guns and 5 types of ammo he had no knowledge of. Bucky figured that meant those items were experimental prototypes of Starks that had never made it into mass production for some reason. That was where he found the assault rifle / grenade launcher combo. It made his gun and explosion loving heart trip a little. 5 minutes with the thing in the range and Bucky was damn near in love. And had also figured out why it hadn't gone into production. The recoil on the thing, especially in grenade mode, would dislocate or even stress fracture most soldiers' shoulders. But with his metal-clad arm and shoulder, that wasn't a problem. Recoil aside, it was a thing of beauty, and Stark was never getting it back. Better still, there was more than one of them. He'd promptly snagged a second one for Steve, since the serum meant Steve would be able to handle the recoil too. He also grabbed an entire duffel's worth of ammo, both grenades and bullets, for them to share between them. It took him less than 2 minutes to convince Steve to try it out after their little reunion. But then Bucky knew how to manipulate Steve. Well, most of the time. It didn't always work because Steve was both perceptive and stubborn. Bucky still had a far better success rate of getting Steve to be sensible than anyone else. Which, it had to be admitted, hadn't been saying much before the war or even during it. Once Steve got that bit between his teeth, he was almost impossible to divert. That said, right now, Bucky was barely even having to try to get his way because of, well, circumstances. He planned to take advantage of it for as long as it lasted. Steve had always preferred to use his shield back in the war. The thing packed quite a wallop in Steve's hands between Steve's strength and how tough the metal of the shield was. Add in Steve's ability to bounce the shield off of everything in sight, and the shield got downright lethal, making a gun redundant much of the time. Steve hadn't been shy about using guns when needed, though, despite preferring the shield. There'd been times when depending on the shield alone hadn't been practical. Times they were somewhere with little to nothing for Steve to bounce it off of. Them in the middle of a cornfield, facing off against Nazi infantry in a trench 30 feet away, rather than Hydra for a change. Or in such cramped confines, he couldn't launch it effectively. Narrow corridors and Hydra bunkers, commandos at their backs, and a veritable legion of Hydra goons swarming them. There'd also been times they'd been under heavy enough fire or up against sufficiently large numbers to make throwing the shield and depriving Steve and everyone directly behind him of its impenetrable protection a really bad idea. And speaking of Bucky's reunion with Steve, the fact Steve had been trembling just a little and more than a little watery-eyed, yeah, that had kind of just added fuel to the kill 'em all fire. Seriously, nobody was ever allowed to mess around with Steve. Ever! The ride to the Target had been weird. Bucky found himself slipping into that ultra-focused mental state all snipers had when they were behind a scope. He'd fought it at first, half afraid it was going to lead to trouble, but it hadn't. Oh, the skills he'd learned as the soldier were there, ready and waiting to be tapped, and that single-minded, only the mission matters mindset was lurking in the back of his brain too. But Bucky discovered he could keep it under control in the context of not attacking his new allies or Steve. He could use the bits he wanted or needed and leave the rest. At least under these particular circumstances. Whether that would hold once the fighting started, he didn't know. Bucky'd say this much for Tony. The guy definitely knew how to make a hell of an entrance. He'd done it on Alfheim too, even if Bucky had missed some of that. This entrance was a whole lot more lethal, not least because it was designed to give the rest of the Avengers a path into the castle. They all piled out, murder and mayhem on their minds, and that's when the problem started. Because Bucky spent the next few hours bouncing in and out of flashbacks to the war. In retrospect, it really shouldn't have surprised him that had happened. Not with Bucky at Steve's left shoulder and Steve wearing the suit. While the modern version was a whole heck of a lot more eye-catching than the old one, it was virtually identical in regards to which colors were where, and even had a battle harness of sorts, making it nearly indistinguishable from the original. Even the Pyro Kid was really not helping on the flashback front during their march across the grounds. Bucky had lost track of how many times Hydra had sicked flamethrower-toting assholes on Steve because they were literally the only thing that gave Steve pause. Hydra goons and lots of fire kind of went together in his head because of that. Though there was definitely stuff that yanked him out of the flashbacks. The terrified screaming and running were definitely different. Oh, Hydra hadn't been any too happy dealing with the commandos back in the day, but they hadn't been, literally, in a few cases, pants-sweatingly terrified. And the few who had been back then had reserved that for Steve. Now they mostly lost their crap when they clapped eyes on Bucky in the Winter Soldier getup, which was definitely different and more than a little pleasing. A few, though, didn't lose it. Instead, they started yelling things, mostly in languages not English, or what Bucky actively remembered of the German and French Gabe had taught the commandos. Things in languages he understood, but had zero memory of learning, which meant he'd learned them as soldier. Things that, well, sort of echoed hollowly in his head, like they were supposed to mean something beyond the words themselves, but didn't. It wasn't until about the third time that happened that Bucky figured out what was going on. They were code words of some sort intended to control Hydra's mindless assassin. For a second or two, Bucky didn't understand why the codes weren't working, but then he remembered Frigga's visit. If there was anyone that he'd met since Loki and Thor hauled him into the tower that could debug his brain and ensure he couldn't be reacquired by dint of code words, it'd be her. Bucky was going to have to remember to thank her if he ever saw her again, or pass on thanks with one of her sons. In the meantime, he just gave a rusty chuckle and taunted the idiot who'd yelled the latest attempt at getting their assassin back in Russian. The horrified, terrified look and panicked backpedaling that produced was absolutely hysterical. The flashbacks, of course, were anything but. The worst of it was that even if Bucky had wanted to say something, he couldn't. As hard as talking had proved to be once he'd started to remember himself, going back into the soldier-esque frame of mind made it about 10 times harder, all but gluing his tongue to the roof of his mouth. The muscle really didn't help! The one taunt aside, he said maybe 3 words the entire time they were fighting, all 3 alerting Steve to a danger that Bucky couldn't shoot, thanks to bad angles, nor reach to deal with physically. Worse, a few of the flashbacks weren't of the war. They were, well, from after. One was bad enough that the others actually noticed him reacting, even if they misinterpreted it. Bucky was as sure as he could be that he'd never been in this castle before, but for half a second there, one of the doors they'd been about to kick down had abruptly become a door to something, he had no idea what, that terrified the ever-loving hell out of him. He'd say this much for the Avengers. He'd barely had time to register the fact he was scared to death before they were crowding him away from the door, getting it out of his line of sight entirely as quickly as they could, without triggering his fighting instincts. Once they'd stopped moving, Steve pushed his cowl off and took the muzzle off of Bucky, obviously attempting to make things as unlike they would have been for Soldier as he could, given the circumstances. "Easy, Buck. Just breathe, okay?" Steve said, then gave a bit of a grin. "Like you always used to tell me when my asthma acted up. Deep and slow as you can. In. Slow out." Bucky, despite the circumstances, had grinned right back at Steve for the irony. He'd lost count of the times he'd talked Steve through an asthma attack over the years. It took a minute or two, but Bucky managed to calm back down, though whether it was the breathing or having Steve in his face or both that helped the most, he didn't have a clue. Once everything was said and done, they stacked the surviving Hydra assholes like so much cord wood in the back of the jet and hauled them, with the exception of the Von Struckers, whom Tony and Steve wanted to talk to personally, to S.H.I.E.L.D. Fury was entertaining. He hadn't seemed quite sure whether to be pissed right off at the Avengers pulling this stunt or thrilled to his toes to have people to interrogate about the threat they posed to the world. And that was after he went ash gray at the sight of Bucky. There had been a brief discussion on the way to whatever S.H.I.E.L.D. base it was they'd invaded with their load of Hydra goons. It hadn't so much been a question of whether or not to reveal Bucky's existence and unwilling identity as the Soldier, but when and how. There was absolutely no way to hide Bucky's existence permanently. Not with the prevalence of cameras and recording equipment in this day and age. Someone, somewhere, would get photographic or video proof of his existence that Jarvis wouldn't be able to wipe out before more people saw said evidence. According to Tony, Pepper already had the Stark Industries legal team all over the whole thing, ready, able, and willing to tear to pieces anyone that decided they were going to be assholes. Notifying Fury was, evidently, the first step in going public. "Mostly," Tony said, "because if we don't tell him first, he'll throw a tantrum, and we'll have to waste a lot of time and effort calming his tits for him." They'd spent roughly an hour explaining things as regarding Bucky to Fury. Bucky was very aware of the fact that the entire time the Avengers surrounded him, ensuring nothing and no one could reach him without getting through them first. Bucky appreciated the gesture because there were a whole lot of hands hovering near or actually clutching weapons. Bucky made sure to keep his body language as loose and non-threatening as he was currently capable of, which wasn't saying much because combat readiness had been trained into his muscle, bone, and sinew to the point he didn't even have to think about it for obvious reasons. He'd mostly forgotten how to not look like he was ready, able, and willing to kill a person on a second's notice. Finally, though, they returned to the tower. The Von Struckers were stashed in the cages in the basement. Because none of them were enhanced the way Yelena had been, they wouldn't be able to escape, or so said Tony, and Bucky was willing to believe him, as he knew what had gone into the construction of the area and what defenses the tower had, and Bucky mostly didn't, though he'd gotten down to a thing or two.